The title of his presentation is The Postmodern Paradigm of Narratives and How the Afghan War Was Lost, something that many of us were talking about a great deal last evening, and talking about, of course, from a distance. But you're not talking from a distance, you're talking from the heart and center of things. And so we're extremely pleased to have you join us and look forward to what you have to say. You have the mic, you have the video, and you have our interest.
Thank you so much for having me, everyone. It's truly an honor. And thank you so much for the very gracious introduction as well. So what I was saying was, I not only want to focus on the past and what happened, I also want to talk about where we are now and how the world moves ahead, because that's a very important discussion about Afghanistan that needs to be had. The idea is something that I like to reiterate, is that the Taliban did not win the war. It's the Afghan Republic, it was the international community that lost it. That means that when there are so many different approaches to the same problem, and you are trying to oppose or contain a movement that has a very unified objective, despite the structure that is very loosely organized, they still manage to do better. As you are all well aware, intractable conflicts by definition are conflicts that persist because there is no way to solve it. And that's mostly because they're just such deep convictions rooted within the society and the people. They create moral conflicts, and there are enduring rivalries and social conflict. Kreisberg says that there are three differences majorly between intractable and tractable conflicts. It's their persistence, the scale of destruction and suffering that it causes, and its resistance and opposition to resolution. And there is also this idea of how, if you look, and we'll move on to the postmodern paradigm of intractable conflicts, you will realize that the story evolves with time. So the reason you started your conflict keeps evolving, keeps reaching a more mythological level that is then believed on face value and not challenged by the generations that follow after. And since it's by definition durable conflict that has existed for more than one generation, the meaning as well then evolves and becomes something that is more like a doctrine to be believed. Intractable conflicts have important identity issues and moral differences to them. These are high-stake resources issues. There is a struggle for power and self-determination. These are ideas that everyone would be partially aware of. And there's a very famous quotation from Atwood's book that says, you're never going to kill storytelling because it's built into the human plan. We come with it. And that's a very important idea for those who are studying narratives, to understand exactly what pan-Islamist groups are putting out there and how it is appealing to the general public so much. So if we move forward, the next slide, you will see the definition of what narratives actually are. A lot of times when we talk about narratives and why people choose to approach a conflict the way that they do. So the postmodern paradigm of looking at intractable conflicts generally sees a conflict as a story, right? And this is it becomes a narrative, a myth, just to give context to what you're doing. So you interpret your own actions, both in the past and what you're going to do in the present, based on that matrix that you have built for yourselves. And there's unquestionable criteria for what is right in a given context. So, I think mostly the reason why we create narratives as well is not only to be okay with what we are doing and understand it, because I think if you guys remember, there's a very famous quotation by Dostoevsky who says that if God did not exist, then everything would be permitted. That was later challenged by another philosopher who said the fact that God exists means everything is permitted, because then we have this justification, this delegation of authority. And the delegation of authority doesn't always have to be to an individual person. Sometimes it is to a story, it is to a grander cause. And the narratives are what the grander causes eventually become. And the way people who approach intractable conflicts through a postmodern paradigm, they want to have critical reflection. They want to sit down and have a dialogue. And this is something that we're actually working on in Afghanistan right now. One of the projects that I'm trying to work on is to get one of the Taliban leaders, preferably Anas Haqqani, who doesn't hold an official office among the Taliban group, to sit down and have a dialogue with people who have a different vision for Afghanistan. And through that, we can communicate what is driving us and the narratives that we've created and what we want to achieve. So through either critical reflection, dialogue, direct confrontation, the idea is you need to make the people that are party to the conflict understand the actual complexity of reality. Because very often what narratives do is create an alternative reality for us. And we'll look at it moving forward as to when we cover all the different narratives that were at play in Afghanistan, to understand exactly how these narratives play a very important role in modifying behavior and getting us to act in specific ways. And we need to, just to get beyond this narrative, and if you're wanting to break it, you have to sit down and you have to tell people that these narratives are very arbitrary. They don't belong to you, but they've been given to you, and how you need to approach them to change them. Unfortunately, in this conflict, these narratives were at war with each other, the three narrative grounds that were created by the Taliban movement. So there was never an actual intent on sitting down and using any of these mechanisms to move beyond the narrative. Everyone was trying to protect their narratives as well and propagate them to further their cause. This even includes as to how you portray a conflict. I remember Afghanistan back in the time of the Mujahideen, and the curriculum used to go with regards to the ABCs would be A for Allah, B for bomb, and so on and so forth. And then we have a letter T and says T for topak, which means rifle. And this was how the story, the actual educational books or syllabus of the students was. And I don't know if most of you would be aware of this, but even in Nebraska, Arkansas, we had a curriculum specifically designed by the university there for the Afghan refugees that had come in back when the Soviets invaded. And within that curriculum as well, I think it says C for communist and J for jihad, and it had this whole alphabetical order. So it's not just a Afghan thing; it's a very East and West inclusive approach as well that we tend to design. The way our students even learn the most basic things, such as alphabets, to indoctrinate them and to give them a story and a narrative to live by. And the way media portrays it. And this is where things have changed quite a bit. A lot of times when I'm teaching terrorism studies, one of the major questions is people ask, how did terrorism become such a relevant thing? And where was it all this time in human history? And one of the major reasons why modern day terrorism has become such a huge threat has been the advent of mass communication. When you live in a world where information keeps going back and forth from one edge of the world to the other so quickly, that means these narratives can be exchanged. One of the most effective tools of Al-Qaeda and ISIS recruitment, if you do watch any ISIS recruitment videos, they are Hollywood level production videos. And one of the reasons is that they know their audience exactly, and they know exactly what story they need to tell them, especially with regards to ISIS, how they kept on telling their fighters that there was a prophecy made for a final battle in Dabiq, which was supposed to be the end of times battle between the others and the non-believers and the Muslims. So that in itself is a story that you're telling people, a story that hasn't happened, and you just get people to get there and fight. So if we move forward, we can look at the three different narratives that were at play in Afghanistan. Before that, really quickly, I would like to cover Arshetti's work in 2017, where they talk about how narratives are constructed. And the very basic unit is your own individual narrative. How are you constructing that individual narrative that gives meaning to your identity? And there are quite a few times in history, in modern history, where we see people modifying our identities for us through the narratives that are given to us. For example, if you study the stolen children of Uganda, you would see that the Christian armies within the local groups would go and kidnap children, and then they would get them to burn either their own village or other villages, or bring in more children that refuse to be part of the army. And these recruits are required as an initiation process to beat up those other children. And all of those things, these actions that are being committed, as we'll see in the next slide as well, is how you change your identity. So look, your identity is at the core. Then you're given some information and you're told specific ideas that end up manifesting in actions that you commit, and those actions change who you are. Think about it in your daily lives as to who you were, what you were taught, what you ended up doing, and how that ended up changing who you were. So if we move back to the previous slide, there was also the concept of the Janissaries in Turkey, where these were Christian children picked up from their villages and raised in the courts of the caliph. And these people would be the most brutal against the Christians themselves. Why? Because despite their identity, the knowledge fed to them and the actions that they had committed, it had changed and evolved devolved based on who you ask, their identity into whoever they had become. And this also helps us create imagined communities, meaning the people that share the narrative story with me are my own community. For example, even something as small as supporting a football club, or creating lines like "you shall never walk alone," or I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong, but there's an English club that has that line as well. But all of those are, in a way, narratives that are uniting people to this common identity that they think that they belong to. And then this works at a larger scale with regards to extremist groups and countries and national identities. And here's the thing, the research that Archetti did was talk about how we can challenge this mentality about how we can. So initially they were like, okay, how are people being recruited for Al-Qaeda and Daesh? And Anwar al-Awlaqi, who was later killed in Yemen through an American bombing, he was one person who would connect with people abroad, youngsters, and then give them all these ideas and concepts to eventually get them to come and join the jihad. Why was that so effective? Could it work if we could block all media outlets for them, or any access to the media that they had, which is something impossible to do? So the other idea was, how do we put out enough content to block out their content? And at the core of the study that Archetti did was the idea that we only believe stuff or take narratives from people we think share our identity. So with regards to outsiders, there's a resistance towards this narrative being given to us because we think that they lack credibility, right? And this is at the core of us failing to counter the messaging and the narrative being propagated by pan-Islamist groups like Al-Qaeda, like ISIS. And as long as we cannot take people from within the community to preach otherwise to those people, no one is going to listen to people that are considered outsiders. And lastly, there's this constant evolving cycle of knowledge, action, identity, knowledge, and action, which you saw in the next diagram. So if we move 2 slides forward, we can now look at exactly what happened in Afghanistan. And this talk is majorly focused on...
We have only about 5 minutes left for the presentation, just to let you know that.
Sorry?
We have only about 5 minutes left for your presentation, just to let you know.
Actually, let me switch my internet side. Yeah, can you hear me better now?
I can hear you fine, but we only have about 5 minutes more for your presentation.
Okay, I thought I had 40 minutes to speak, though.
Yes, but it started very late. That's the problem.
Oh, okay.
So,
okay, I didn't know.
Well,
okay.
let's stick with 5 to 10 minutes if we could, please.
Okay, just give me 10 minutes and I'll quickly get to the... Okay, so the three narratives that were based on a presentation, a policy paper that I'd written to the vice president of Afghanistan at the peak of the war and the blitz that the Taliban were committing. I told him that there were three narratives that were at play. The first narrative was the religious legitimacy narrative. Then there was the impending victory narrative. And lastly, there was the foreign proxy narrative. So if we move forward to try and understand what the religious legitimacy narrative was, there is the general idea of general legitimacy as well. So the Taliban kept saying that they were a legitimate government that was forcefully removed from power illegitimately. And the Afghan Republic was saying that they were elected representatives of the Afghan people. Now, the problem was a lot of things that the Taliban were doing with regards to the corruption and the large scale of it. So they had embezzlement, aid fungibility, the election rigging, nepotism, to name just a few of the things that made it so corrupt to the core that the Afghan people had given up on the state much before the Taliban actually took the physical territory. And so they were undermining their own legitimacy caused by the way that they were acting, the Republic was. On the other end, when we talk about the religious legitimacy narrative, the Taliban were projecting this narrative saying, we are religious scholars. There is an obligation given to us by God to expel imperial forces from any Islamic country. So that religious narrative was something that was never truly challenged by the Afghan government. And the Taliban kept claiming that by virtue of their definition of being religious scholars, they had a right to dictate as to what was legitimate and what wasn't. What Ashraf Ghani, the president, ex-president, was doing was, in order to appeal to the Pashtun vote in the southern areas, he started campaigns of building more and more mosques rather than creating an institutionalized process to mandate the religious schools in Afghanistan. He was just building more infrastructure for them, which ended up playing against his own interests. Lastly, the Afghan government did recognize how important it was as to who had the religious legitimacy for their cause, which is when they started organizing large summits of Muslim scholars, where they said that the fight in Afghanistan was illegitimate. The Taliban movement should not be committing the atrocities that they were. But like we said earlier, since these Muslim summit leaders were outsiders, this was a narrative that the Afghan rural population, or the Taliban specifically, were not willing to believe. So if we move forward, the second narrative was the impending victory narrative. And this is where the philosophy of religious conviction comes in, where when your narrative is so strong, it creates an alternative reality with regards to people who really believe to their core. And I think there's a quotation about it. How do you defeat a person who stares into the barrel of your gun and sees heaven, right? Because they're living in this world where worldly incentives do not really mean anything. So with regards to the Taliban, every time that they would think that they were losing the fighting, which is because we have 4 different conditions of when a group is more likely to negotiate and when they are most likely to not negotiate, there are circumstances where, based on your current position, you have to see, are you winning or losing? Are your fortunes going to get better or worse? Based on these 2 matrices, you can decide how to move forward. Now, the problem was, with the Taliban having the extreme levels of religious conviction that they didn't really care if they were shooting Kalashnikovs at B-52 jet fighters. They didn't really care if their fighters didn't have salaries, food to eat, or that they lost almost 1,000 fighters in Helmand. Yet they kept coming. Why? Because the Quran gives them a narrative saying, Nasrun min Allahi wa fathun qareeb, meaning victory is ever close, right? So no matter what you're facing, God will help you. Now, this impending victory narrative was further reinforced by the United States not only choosing to withdraw, but choosing to unconditionally withdraw after a peace deal in which they gave the Taliban more leverage than they had. That means that they gave them a better deal than they got. And on the other end, the unconditional withdrawal, and then the security assessments that they kept giving. Intelligence assessment, government will collapse in 6 months after foreign withdrawal. Government will collapse in 90 days after withdrawal. All those were really feeding into the Taliban narrative of them seeing victory soon. And it was taking away from the military's conviction to fight. So the Afghan National Defense Forces, despite the tactical blunders that the Afghan government committed, they tactically retreated from the districts, leaving zero buffer zones around the cities, losing their own advantage of being able to use aerial bombing and artillery, only to be stuck within cities where the advantage was for the Taliban. Then there was the idea of the president living in an alternative reality where he thought that he was going to win this war. The corruption. There's also a story of Shakespeare where in Henry V, he talks about how Henry V, after capturing French soldiers, orders a public execution of those French soldiers in front of the French army. One of the reasons why he does that is to show the French army how brutal he could be, but also a subtle message was given to his own fighters saying, if you ever surrender, this is what the French would do to you. This was something countered by the Taliban. Even with their impending victory, they were giving the Afghan soldiers the option to surrender. And that was extremely effective with regards to the Afghan soldiers and their low motivational levels. If they knew the only way was either victory or death, they would have still fought more. But since the Taliban were giving them the option to surrender, that worked in the Taliban's favor. The Taliban used very efficient propaganda during this war. One of the reasons why international media now says, how were they so efficient at using PR before? How are they so bad at it now? What changed? Nothing changed. The difference is, at that point, the need of the hour was to project brutality and atrocities to scare off their enemies and their opposition. The same tactics, the only tactics that the Taliban know with regards to PR is not working now that they are in a government role. The impending victory narrative also muffled voices within the Taliban movement that wanted to politically settle. So that was another end. If we move to the last narrative, you will see that the foreign proxy narrative was to take away, this sort of fed into the legitimacy narrative as well. So the Taliban initially, when they started fighting, their cause was to expel foreign troops. After foreign troops announced withdrawal, their goal then was to expel the puppet regime that the West had left behind. Now, this is one narrative that the Afghan government did partially better at, and that was because they created this narrative that the Taliban were a Pakistani proxy. This worked so well that some Afghan soldiers, when they had to surrender, they kept shouting, saying, I will not give my weapons up to Punjab, right? So that created some level of conviction amongst the troops. The problem was that with regards to the Afghan population, this was affecting the urban population who was willing to buy that narrative and hate on Pakistan, hate on the Taliban. But the larger population of the rural areas was already lost due to the failures of the Afghan government. And the Afghan government basically used this narrative to cloak its own failures and not have to address it. If you move to the last slide, there are a few questions that I want you to think about, and there's a very healthy discussion that can be had with regards to this, and I'm available for this discussion whenever possible, is the question of whether the Taliban have changed or not as to having the old guard in the cabinet. Does that show that they're willing to work towards a new Afghanistan? Which one was better, the republic that we had or the emirate that had come? In a way, it's a question of, is it okay to live under a corrupt system, or should we move towards a system that is more transparent, partially just, but also has tyrannical tendencies? Is it okay for a society to exist in a social hierarchy where piety is the point to measure people against? Should the Taliban have used the Afghan government structure as spoils of war, or should they have moved towards an inclusive government? Was that ever a realistic option? What sort of civil liberties can the Taliban give with the traditionalism that they represent? I mean, there's also this idea that there's a blessing in all of this. I think Ledark talks about conflict transformation and how there's always an opportunity in conflicts having ended. The post-conflict society in Afghanistan has coffin sellers now that are celebrating for not having to sell many coffins as they used to. But on the other end, we have a crumbling economy where women are selling their jewelry. What should the international community's role be? And the very important $1 million question is, how will the regime change happen in Afghanistan? Is it short-term, long-term? What would a civil war that is coming look like? Should we be looking forward to it, or should we be actively trying to negate it? If we move to the last slide, I will thank you for your time. I'm really sorry. I think I got my GMTs wrong, and I've been moving around since I've officially received my third warning from the Taliban for being too outspoken for them. In the end, I just want to take a minute to appeal to your humanities and tell you that there are a lot of academics in Afghanistan that are at risk. And I wish that institutes would open their doors and find the potential in these people for research. This diaspora is your way of investing in Afghanistan's future, because they will be returning to their country and trying to make it better. My email is there. My Twitter handle is there. I've been speaking about the reconciliation, a possible reconciliation of Afghanistan, and it starts off with my own personal story, because I am the grandson of a asterisk or apostrophes warlord. I have become who I have become through my journey. And I'm hoping the two very different worlds in Afghanistan can reconcile and find a middle point to have a functional, sustainable Afghanistan. We do not want the Taliban to fail, because the Taliban failing means Afghanistan fails, means we're stuck with a failing government. And then the only way to have regimes change would be another violent civil war that we are not willing to pay the price for. So thank you so much again. It was a pleasure and an honor to speak to all of you.